I do a lot of driving in my work. Sometimes I get really tired and worry about falling asleep at the wheel. Sometimes I crank tunes on the radio and sing along loudly to pump myself up to stay alert. I'm not a big caffeine fan. I don't even drink coffee in the morning, but there are times when I feel like I have no other choice than to pull off the road and get a shot of Joe to keep me going during the drive. Sometimes even this doesn't work, and I have to rely on more drastic measures. That's when I deploy my no-fail, stay-awake method. I dial up some of my conservative friends. Why? Well, invariably, we're going to get into an argument. We often have a heated discussion about religion or politics. And pretty soon, I'm wired and wide awake. From West Virginia Public Broadcasting, this is Us and Them. It's the podcast where we tell stories from America's cultural divides. I'm Trey Kay. In the last episode, I shared my shocked feelings about the recent presidential election. I said that I suspect that we might need to do some processing about this bruising campaign and the forthcoming Trump presidency. As a result of Us and Them's recent financial downturn, for several months we were on a production freeze. But for this show, I want to let you know some of the election-related things that I was wrestling with during our downtime. So last July, I'd been working in New York City for several days. It had been a hectic week, and I was really tired. I was tuckered out, and I really needed to head home, a 2-hour drive north, where I live in New York's Hudson Valley. Did I say I was dog-tired? As I headed up north on the Taconic Parkway, my eyelids were growing really heavy, and I decided to give one of my conservative buddies a call. After some chit-chat, I shifted right to the contentious topics. Here's something that I wanted to talk about. Remember when the Republican convention was getting underway in Cleveland? In the office where I'd been working earlier that week, I'd gathered around a computer monitor with several of my coworkers to watch an angry revolt of Never Trump delegates protesting on the convention floor. It really seemed like chaos. I asked my conservative friend how she felt about this meltdown. And instead of answering, she pivoted and jabbed me about the Democratic National Committee rigging things against Bernie Sanders. I found her concern for Bernie to be amusing because she always referred to him as a card-carrying communist, a quality that she felt was a non-starter in America's red states. I retorted with something about fact-checkers having a field day with all the bald exaggerations of Trump and that the GOP presumptive nominee's statements had earned more liar, liar, pants on fire ratings than any other candidate in recent memory. My friend parried with comments about Hillary Clinton's email server and the corruption of the Clinton Foundation, and then we were off to the races. She told me that she didn't like Trump as a person, but that she felt that he was America's best hope of returning the country back to a godly path. A godly path? A narcissist, foul-mouthed Lothario like Trump was going to put our nation back onto a godly path? Really? I asked her how she squared her Christian values with his boastful, womanizing past. And as far as keeping myself awake and not on the side of the road in a crumpled heap of metal, this conversation was doing the trick. I was feeling bright and alert, and I was sure that I was going to make it home safely. Then my friend bumped things up a notch. She told me that I was incapable of understanding the serious nature of this election because I didn't have God at the center of my life. This comment hit me like a mega jolt of adrenaline. I felt like Uma Thurman's character in Pulp Fiction after John Travolta's character stabbed an EpiPen through her breastbone and into her heart. My friend has said things like this before, and it really angers me. It strikes me as exceedingly arrogant for anyone to speak on behalf of God. But what really amps me up is this assumption that I don't have God or a higher power in the center of my life. First of all, if I do or don't, it's my business. But the fact is that faith is a very important part of my life. And I've discussed this many, many, many times with my friend. But it never seems to connect. The problem, as I see it, is that she only values the conservative, fundamentalist Christian belief that she's practiced all her life. And to anyone who believes differently, well, they're just simply lost. End of story. But on this occasion, my friend's comment really got under my skin. Why? Well, I'd been going through a really tough time professionally and personally. And this was a time when I was battling a sense of fear, and that all that I had to get through it was faith. And at this very time, my friend pushed the "you don't believe in the right God" button. And that sent me off like a rocket. I could feel my head pound. I was literally seeing red. Within seconds, I started screaming at the top of my lungs. Who in the hell are you to tell me that I don't have faith at the center of my life? How arrogant of you to assume that your religious belief gives you any better understanding than me as to the right direction of the nation. And I just kept shouting, "How dare you? How dare you?" Just louder and louder. And I started to feel a twinge in my chest. I could hear my friend break in and try to defend her position, but I couldn't focus on a word that she was saying. All I could think about was this pain in my chest, and I was worried that something might be wrong with my heart. Hey, I'm really sorry. I just can't talk anymore. And I disconnected the phone and threw the phone away from me.
Yeah, some people have a big difference and some people don't.
Let's lift this up in the back. Give me a couple of real deep breaths in and out there. Okay, yeah, let's sit up. Everything sounds and looks normal. I mean, the blood work, the cholesterol, so, the HDL is low, which is the good cholesterol, quote unquote. The triglycerides are high.
I try to eat well. I exercise regularly. I lead a pretty healthy life, but I do have some family heart issues.
It's probably just stress, but on that background has us a little bit concerned. Not the worst idea to take a baby aspirin, just because that's the most effective medicine to prevent a heart attack.
So baby aspirin, what, daily?
Daily,
In the morning?
Probably safe if you get any discomfort.
So apparently I'm not going to keel over from physical conditions. But what about stress and mental health? Is it just too much to talk about politics?
I am Liz Brenner, and I'm a clinical social worker and family therapist in Watertown, Massachusetts.
The reason that I came to see you today is because I feel like in many ways I have been trying to do work that I don't think people in my circle are doing, which is trying to reach across the culture war divide and speak respectfully and empathetically with people who don't believe as I do. And yet here I was in this situation where I lost my way in trying to do that. I got to the point where I got emotionally identified with my position and I got really angry. And I don't know, is this a problem with me? Or I'm wondering if it's a systemic problem that's going on with America right now. Is the water just so hot that we're all tense and that we're all stressed out?
Well, I would say it feels like it's a pretty toxic environment that we're all living in right now. And it's complicated because you're dealing with this in your work and life. Your work is not a break from what's going on in the election. You're not getting much rest.
So I'm not getting much rest because I'm really kind of diving in the waters where this tension is.
Right. You're trying to broach the cultural divide, if you will, at a time when the cultural divide is so much more intense. And it sounds like what happened was put you in a position where your life experience was against the values that you're trying to enact in the work that you're doing.
What do you mean by that?
Your podcast is about talking to people and making relationships across difference. And then with your friend, you're having a terrible argument. So that's pretty stressful.
Right. She was speaking to me about my faith in a higher power, my faith in God, and speaking about it in a way as though she has a purchase on what is truth, and everything that I believe is not that. And that just made me really angry.
So a therapist might ask you, what about that particular conversation with her is evocative for you? Like, what keeps you from being able to hold on to your values of just being curious and understanding and versus being triggered and reactive and stressed out and angry?
Well, this is a time where I feel like I've had to rely on faith or my own personal faith.
That's,
And when she basically challenged that, it makes me light up like a Christmas tree and not a happy Christmas tree.
So that's challenging because I think the only way to have useful conversations across these intense differences is to be able to just tolerate the other person's position but not have an agenda about changing them. Because when you're in a cross-cultural conversation and you're trying to change the other person, that's a power struggle, right? As opposed to that's interesting. How did you come to those beliefs, right? But she pretty clearly has an agenda about wanting to help you through changing you. And I'm not sure what your agenda is about being in a relationship with her.
I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. Maybe I would want to change her. Maybe that is my objective too. I don't know if I'm conscious of that, but I can certainly see that there is a power struggle. Okay, so my conservative friend and I had that dynamic going on in the context of this contentious Trump versus Hillary campaign. It just seemed to me that this kind of ratcheted things up. And I wondered if Liz thought so.
Sure. And I think about how do I need to take care of myself for myself, but also, I do delicate work. I have to be on my game with people. I might be treating people who have different values than I do. I have to be very thoughtful about how I handle that. Whereas, in your profession, you may not be trained to think that way so much, although you do have to be objective to some degree.
I do think that in some ways I'm doing something slightly different than what I think most journalists do with this podcast. And that is, I'm trying to be upfront with where I'm coming from. Because when I'm speaking to somebody, I can't really proffer myself as neutral on issues. I'm acknowledging where I'm coming from, but I'm also trying to empathetically listen to where you are coming from. And I think that what I'm learning, and maybe the reason that I'm sitting here with you today, is that this is tough work, and I'm learning some of the difficult parts of what that's about.
Right. It sounds like you could take it to another level of living into the values that you have that helped you to create this podcast to begin with. And what you're trying to do, I think, with us and them is to create conversations that allow people to get new information so they can be apprised of a wider breadth of data because the world is so big, and that maybe we can be more in the same room even if we're not on the same page.
I really like hearing an accomplished therapist like Liz Brenner explain how her work is delicate and that she needs to constantly assess the dynamics that play out between her and her clients. but that it's important to protect herself. I think this is something I need to be more conscious of in my sometimes stressful us and them work. Coming up, we'll speak to another mental health professional, my shrink, and a black minister who opposed Donald Trump but makes a curious comparison between Trump and Martin Luther King Jr. He also provides a biblical perspective on the president-elect.
We really don't know what the darkness is hiding. It may very well be that the darkness is hiding a glory that we just can't see. And we can't figure this out. It doesn't make sense.
I'm Trey Kay, and this is Us and Them, which is supported in part by grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
So I went to Liz Brenner's office well aware of the anxiety that I was feeling regarding the toxic environment of the presidential election. But I wondered if I was the only one. I wondered if Brenner had any insight about other Americans feeling anxious enough about the campaign to seek out a professional's help. She said that she hadn't really noticed any significant change with her clients. However, a few short weeks after our meeting, she sent me an article that reported that, indeed, many Americans were confiding their election anxieties to therapists. So to some mental health professionals, this election, its stakes, hostilities, and violence, were taking a toll on their patients' psychological health. But at this point when I was having conversations with Liz Brenner, the election was still weeks away. And the polls were persuading me that I did not need to fear the election's outcome, a possible Trump administration. But then, as you know, it happened. We went to bed hoping that we'd have a clearer idea in the morning, and woke up just as confused as the night before, but also in deep despair.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton. She congratulated us, it's about us, on our victory, and I congratulated her.
Those of us who were expecting a different result were not prepared for the reality of President Trump.
It's been building, yeah. And for the past couple of days, it feels like this has been a decompression chamber for a lot of people, or just a place for them to struggle to try to get a grip on what seems incomprehensible.
That's my therapist, Stephen. When I spoke with Liz Brenner, I needed a general understanding of how therapists might be dealing with people's anxiety over the election. The day after the election, I had some anxiety of my own to deal with. And I wasn't the only one.
A lot of those feelings that people have been expressing and going, hey, they're coming up for me. Right? In this particular case, my general response has been one of, anxiety, uncertainty, flirting with despair.
One thing that might lessen my anxiety is by ceasing to engage and talk about this on Facebook, etc. I engage in that conversation because part of it is me processing this. Another part of it is me also kind of engaging in the work that I do with this podcast and really kind of reaching out and kind of understanding the other side of America, the side that's different than me. But in doing that, it is raising my anxiety. And I feel like in an election, like the one that we've just gone through, which has just been just off the charts brutal. And, now it's over. And it just stands to reason that people are going to have tender emotions that are not just going to change, hours after the thing is over. That just doesn't make sense to me. And to expect them to come back to a place where we're, I guess, all rowing the boat together, I think that you need to give people some time to heal and to possibly vent their spleen a little bit and stomp the ground. At the very least, I feel like I am trying to do the work of understanding the winners in this situation, the people who won, the ideas that carried the day.
And in understanding them, what would you hope to do with that? How would that be helpful to you?
Well, one of the things that you'll hear in this country, it's like, America's too much. I'm going to go live in England or Germany or Australia, or Canada, It's like you still basically have the same problems. I'm probably going to find people who, may be the parts that are not like Trey, not like Trey's tribe, not like Trey's coalition.
So the logical extension is that if you are going to find the solution is to either pack up and go live somewhere else, pretty soon you'll be, where? On the deserted island or the top of the mountain all by your lonesome. So how do you have a conversation that allows for people to not see things the same way?
Well, you start from the premise that people are not going to see things the same way.
Right. But you can start from a premise that says that that's the case, and therefore I have to negate that other person. Or you can start from a premise that says, somehow I've got to find a way to incorporate what their perspective is into my perspective if I want to live with them.
Right.
I'm going to look at this election as through the lens of, wow, there is a huge segment of humanity in this country that don't feel recognized. And somehow, if we're going to get along here, we've got to find a way to do it, even when we disagree. Doesn't mean we have to stop disagreeing. So part of the process is finding a way to disagree that doesn't negate. It says, you don't matter, you don't count, I don't see you, you don't exist.
Regardless of the fact that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, over 62 million voted for Donald Trump. If these Americans have previously felt ignored, felt as though they don't count, they've officially made themselves heard. This coalition of mostly white voters feels Trump speaks for them. In part, their movement is a reaction to the empowerment of other segments of American society who have historically felt disenfranchised, ignored, left behind, such as African Americans. I decided to reach out to a friend who's been around the block a few more times than me, who knows something about this.
When you are a kid growing up in churches in the era that I grew up, if you could recite a pretty good Easter speech, then the older saints in the church would say, that boy's going to be a preacher.
That's Reverend Ronald English, a Baptist minister that I know from my hometown in Charleston, West Virginia.
And so I got that label early on, and I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I want to be doctoral. And I think my hesitation had to do with the kinds of preachers that I had seen who were very hoopalistic, as we used to say.
Hoopalistic?
Yeah, hoopalistic means that they had a hoop, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they were making sense all the time, but they knew how to turn a crowd. They knew how to entertain. Then, under the influence of Martin Luther King Jr. as pastor of Ebenezer, where I grew up, I mean, we grew up in the same church.
In Atlanta?
Yeah, in Atlanta. Right.
They didn't just go to the same church. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. actually ordained Ron English back in the 1960s. It was Dr. King's wisdom and manner that impressed the young minister.
He had brought another kind of perspective to ministry in terms of a kind of intellectual, emotional, but not hoopalistic kind of preaching. And I was just impressed with that.
I wanted to speak to you today because I've felt that I have personally, and I've noticed other people who have had a lot of anxiety and difficulty with this election. Before the election, I found that my anxiety was higher than it normally was. I was angry with people, lashing out with people, getting into like screaming my head off at some points. So my first question would be, have you had to speak or pastor people with regard to any anxiety regarding this election?
No, not in the sense that you just described. I believe that as an African American, I don't feel as threatened or as anxious or as depressed as you have described, primarily because of two things. Number one, Dr. King used to say, the truth crushed the earth will rise again. Barack Obama's election was suggesting that we had arrived at a place of equality. We had not dealt with the undercurrent of racism that had run through this nation. And I think Trump and the Trump movement was able to give a avenue that was related to the fact that we have not dealt with race and that we have not dealt with the deeper issues of what it means to be equal. And therefore, it took 8 years to react to the fact that we had made that change. And I think that during that 8 years, it was possible for certain elements in the society to feel less uncomfortable about letting their feeling be known that they felt like they had been voiceless and overlooked, which was flipping the script in terms of how black folk had felt. And that it just took a while for that part of our culture to have a means of expression that they could use as a legitimate gripe.
As I hear you say this, and I was speaking about the anxiety that I was feeling before, I was surprised by the result of the election. It doesn't sound like you were surprised.
Not really. The reason I'm not surprised is because the reality of racism weaving in the very fabric of what it is to be in this country is something I was just expecting would show up in terms of a reaction, and it happened to be in this particular way.
I have to tell you, I loved the service yesterday, and I loved the message, focusing on this idea of prepare ye the way of the Lord.
But Isaiah, as the prophet, is saying right there where you are, in the wilderness, that's where I want you to prepare a way for the Lord.
Amen.
Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Now, that's a good word, but I can hear and feel Israel saying, just like you would say, how are we going to do that? Ain't no construction crew out here. Ain't no contractor out here. There is no machine that we can use to prepare a way, even if we were able to find a way, because the desert has no ways. Hello? We feel...
Is there a message in there that can speak to those of us who are just having a difficult time acclimating to these difficult times?
What the text really says is that I'm coming into the wilderness. Whatever situation of wilderness we are in, whatever moment of darkness we are in, we've been here before. In this country, we've been here before, after the Civil War. And something comes out of the Civil War that brings about a new creation. You don't anticipate how it's going to happen. You really don't know how it's going to happen. And that's my hope in terms of how this may be the evening of a awakening that was not intended by what brought Trump into office. And the biblical perspective on that is that we really don't know what the darkness is hiding. It may very well be that the darkness is hiding a glory that we just can't see. And we can't figure this out. It doesn't make sense. But the question is whether that not making sense is something that shakes our faith to the core, that we run from the darkness or we embrace it, because when it is darkest, we can see the stars.
You know, I look at the differences in our skin complexion, and as I know that you and I have walked a different path in this society,
Yep.
would you probably say back to me, I've walked a different path, and I've kind of seen this show before. Is that what you're saying to me?
Oh, yeah.
A different perspective than I'm used to.
Exactly. And I think that is something that is resident in how we have the tendency to look through a certain lens, because that's how we have been conditioned. And you would have the tendency, and white America has had the tendency to look through a certain lens of privilege. We have been conditioned to look through a certain lens of underprivilege, and therefore fighting for the equity to be on the same level. But I'm saying that that's a perspective in terms of looking at what has happened in American history and how to interpret what is happening now. It's kind of flipped the script where the underprivileged felt like they had not been heard. And here comes someone who says he will speak for them. And that is what fired up the movement. And I've never even thought about it before until now. But in a strange kind of way, Trump was like King.
Huh?
In terms of touching the emotion that he felt and knew was there and firing it into a movement that brought about a critical change in the country. And you remember, King was not identified initially as the leader, but when he responded to what he saw was a need and the fervor of the folk who were mounting that movement, and that's what he just kind of chartered and led. Trump initially didn't, you wouldn't see him as being the leader of the Red Brigade who felt like their voices had not been heard.
Reverend English was quick to note that he was only comparing Trump and King in their ability to tap into a segment of society that felt marginalized.
But it's not about intellect. It's about emotion. And he was able to speak to that emotion of folk who felt like they were unheard and abused and misused. And because of that, he becomes not only their spokesperson to speak for them, but their hero, and now their president. That's how I'm talking about them being, kind of similar in terms of how they responded to a mood that led into a movement.
When you pray for America, what do you say?
It's just a simple thing. Keep hope alive. That we, if we are really rooted and grounded in the kind of faith conviction that we said that we are, then this is the time to test the tenacity of whether we are true to that or not. And therefore, even this shall pass.
I will trust in the Lord. I will trust in the Lord. I will trust in the Lord till I die.
So, as I process my feelings about this election, one of the craziest political events that I've experienced in my life, and I dare say one of the strangest political occurrences in our nation's history, I know that the problem isn't solved and the pain isn't gone. But I'm wrapping my mind around why I felt such angst as the campaign played out, and now as we transition into the forthcoming Trump era. God, it feels so strange saying that. My sister was telling me that a church in her community was having meetings after the election to help people acclimate to the idea of our new president-elect. On their first get-together, the leaders encouraged the shell-shocked attendees to practice saying, "President Trump." My sister says some of the people were having a really tough time saying it. Sometimes I have a tough time saying it. It's tough seeing some of the choices for the new cabinet. Even tougher after reading in the Washington Post that the CIA has strong reason to believe that the Russians did indeed conduct a cyber hacking campaign that was not only designed to disrupt our election process, but more specifically targeted to secure a Trump victory. I mean, if that's true, how can that be okay? How could any American feel good about that? So much of this troubles me, not the least of which is that it seems that a large percentage of our citizens don't seem bothered by it. This is crazy-making to me. But what can I do? My impulse is to fight it and figure out a way how to halt our nation being led by such an unsuitable person who was rejected by most of the people who voted on Election Day. But how to fight it? As President Obama said, elections have consequences. Donald Trump won the contest by the rules that we've collectively agreed upon. I'm not sure how much control I have over the situation, but I'm not sure that I should roll over either. I mean, what to do? My experience thus far teaches me that too much preoccupation could drive me crazy and possibly to a heart attack. As I move forward with my little podcast, I'm going to keep on with what it is that I do best, creating conversations between two entrenched, intractable, sometimes infuriating positions. But in doing so, I also have to take care of my health. You've been listening to Us and Them. This episode was produced by Mitch Hanley, Lori Stern, and me, Trey K., and was edited by Cousin B. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed our theme show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. Rita Krisofi and Mariana Trofimova designed our website at usandthempodcast.com and provide us with images for the web. Our interns are Nicholas Tantillo and Iana Robitaille. The marvelous people at West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.